All right, welcome everyone. We are starting today with Shrimad Bhagavata Mahapurana, Book 10, first half of Book 10, Discourse 31. So we had paused partway through the story of the Rasalillah after the first part of the Rasalillah, and we kind of ended on the cliffhanger of sorts of Krishna having disappeared and left all the gopis alone in the forest in the moonlit night. Discourse 31 is entitled The Gopis' Song During the Rasalila. The gopis sang. So they're essentially singing to Krishna while searching for him in the forest. The gopis sang, "Vraja shines all the more brightly by your avatarana in the house of Nanda and Yashoda. For Lakshmi, the goddess of beauty and prosperity, constantly dwells here from that time in order to catch glimpses of you. O beloved Lord, please reveal yourself and see how your sweethearts who have centered their life in you are searching for you in every quarter. Is it not a massacre here on your part, O granter of boons, who kill us, your gratuitous slaves, O bestower of enjoyment, by your eyes that steal the splendor of the interior of a lovely and full-blown lotus growing in an autumnal pond? We have been saved by you time and again, O jewel among men, from death through poisonous water, from a demon disguised as a serpent, from showers and storm, as well as from strokes of lightning, from the demon that appeared in the form of a calf, as well as from Vyomasura, nay, from every other peril." A footnote here mentions that this is the first we've heard of Vyomasura. That story is actually told after the Rasalila, but commentators conclude that since they're referencing it, and since Shuka never actually says anything to the contrary, it must have happened before this, and Shuka just related those incidents out of order. "Surely you are no mere son of a cowherd woman, Yashoda, being the witness of the internal sense of all embodied souls. Solicited by Brahma, you appeared, O friend, in the race of the Yadus for the protection of the universe. Place on our head, O beloved Lord, your lotus-like palm that has vouchsafed protection, O chief of the Vrishnis, to those that have sought your feet from fear of transmigration, which grants all desires and has clasped the hand of the goddess Sri in the marriage ceremony between Lakshmi and Vishnu. O alleviator of the suffering of the people of Raja, O gallant Lord, whose very smile crushes the pride born of unrequited love of your own people. Accept in your service, O friend, us, your avowed servants, and reveal to us your charming lotus-like countenance. Set on our bosom your lotus feet, which dissipate the sins of all embodied beings that bow down to you, which follow out of affection, even animals that live on grass, which are the abode of beauty and prosperity, and which were dauntlessly placed on the hoods of the terrible Naga, and thereby soothe the pangs of love pent up in our heart. Pray revive with the nectar of your lips, O valiant one, these women in the person of ourselves, who are ready to do your bidding and who are getting charmed, O Lord with lotus eyes, by your melodious speech consisting of delightful expressions and pleasing even to the learned. Munificent are those men who extensively recite on earth your nectar-like story, which is life-giving to the afflicted, has been celebrated by the wise and eradicates all sins, which is auspicious to hear and is most soothing too. Your hearty laugh, O darling, loving glances and leelas which are happy to contemplate on, and your covert jests uttered in secret that went deep into our heart, really agitate our mind now that you are away from us, O deceitful lover. Our mind, O beloved Lord, grows uneasy to think that your feet, charming as a lotus, get pricked with spikes of corn, blades of grass, and sprouts when you go out of Raja pasturing the cattle. You kindle love in our heart, O gallant Lord, again and again, even as you reveal yourself before us at the close of the day, wearing a countenance overhung by dark curly locks and soiled with the dust raised by the cows. The way they said it is raised by the wealth of the gopas, which is the cows. And thus resembling a lotus sprung out of water, surrounded by black bees and covered with pollen. O delighter of souls, pray set on our bosom, O reliever of agony, your most blissful lotus-like feet, which grant the desires of those that bow low to them, and are worshipped by Brahma the lotus-born, which are the ornament of the earth and are worth contemplating upon in times of adversity. Vouchsafe to us, O heroic Lord, the nectar of your lips, which heightens our enjoyment and destroys all grief, which is fully enjoyed by the flute sounded by you, and makes people forget all other attachments. When you proceed to the woods during the daytime, even half a moment becomes an age to us who fail to see you. And dull-witted is he, Brahma, who has created rows of hair on the edge and thus interrupted the joy of the eyes of us all that eagerly behold, without blinking, your splendid countenance overhung by curly hair on your return from the woods at eventide. Completely neglecting our husband, children, kinsmen, brothers, and other relations, O immortal Lord, and enchanted by the shrill note of your flute, we have sought your presence, knowing as we did your alluring ways. What man, O trickster, would abandon helpless women at the dead of night? Perceiving your amorous advances made in secret, your smiling countenance which kindles love in our heart, your loving glances and broad chest, the abode of Sri, the goddess of beauty and prosperity, our mind gets infatuated again and again through intense longing to meet you. Your manifestation on earth, O darling, has put an end to the sorrows of the inhabitants of Raja as well as to the denizens of the forest, and is extremely auspicious for the whole universe. Pray unreservedly administer to us, whose mind is full of longing for you, at least a little of that remedy in the form of your company, which may relieve the pangs of heart of your own people. You traverse the forest on those tender lotus-like feet, which, O darling, we have gently and timidly set on our bosom. Are they not pained by coming in contact with gravel, etc.? The mind of us all, whose life is centered in you, reels at the very thought of it. Thus ends the 31st discourse entitled The Gopis' Song during the Rasalillah, in the first half of Book 10 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 32, the Lord comforts the Gopis during the Rasalillah. Sri Shuka began again. Thus singing at the pitch of their voice and raving in various ways, the Gopi women loudly wailed, O Raja, seized as they were with a longing to behold Sri Krishna. In their very midst appeared all of a sudden Sri Krishna, that scion of Shura, clad in yellow silk and adorned with a garland and wearing a smiling lotus-like countenance, the enchanter of Kamadeva himself, who maddens the whole world. Beholding Sri Krishna, their most beloved Lord, come back, all the women sprang on their feet at once, their eyes wide open with joy, even as the limbs of a body would on finding their life breath returned. One of them clasped the lotus-like hands of Shauri with her joined palms with delight, while another placed on her shoulder his arm smeared with sandal paste. A certain Gopi of delicate limbs took in the hollow of her palms the beetle chewed by him, the rolled up beetle nut roll, while another set his lotus feet on her bosom, burning as she was with the fire of passion. Knitting her brows and closely biting her lower lip, another looked at him as though tormenting him with volleys of her sidelong glances, agitated as she was with anger caused by unrequited love. Another continued to gaze on his lotus-like countenance with unwinking eyes, even though it had been duly contemplated for a long time, but did not feel sated, any more than saints would while contemplating on his lotus feet. A certain Gopi ushered him into her heart through the hollows of her eyes, shut her eyes in order to preclude his egress, in other words, not to let him back out, so to speak, and embracing him with the hairs of her body standing on end, mentally embracing him, stood immersed in bliss like a yogi, united in thought with God. Enraptured with the grand feast of the sight of Sri Krishna, they all shed the agony caused by separation from him, even as men get rid of their grief on meeting an enlightened soul. Surrounded by those women who had shaken off their sorrow, Sri Krishna, the immortal Lord, shone very brightly, O dear Parikshit, like the Supreme Spirit, endowed with his potencies, such as sattva. Taking them with him in a body, the Almighty Lord repaired to the delightful bank of the Kalindi, which was swarmed with black bees, drawn by gentle winds, charged with the fragrance of full-blown jasmines and mandaras, where the darkness of the night had been dispelled by the flood of rays of the autumnal full moon, and on which soft sands had been spread by the hands, in the form of the waves, of the Krishna. The Krishna, with a long A on the end, is another name of the Yamuna River. The Gopis, whose heartache caused by their separation from the Lord had been dissipated by the joy flowing from his darshana, attained the end of their desire, even as the Srutis transcend the realm of desire. Referring to when the Srutis, the Vedic Srutis, transcend from the rituals for material ends, reach the Vedanta, the summit of the Vedas, when they reach unto pure jnana or God realization. Now the gopis prepared a seat for Sri Krishna, the friend of their soul, with their scarfs spotted with the saffron paint from their bosoms. Seated there and honored by them, the aforesaid Almighty Lord, who stands enthroned in the heart of masters of yoga, shone in the midst of that bevy of the gopis, revealing a personality which is the one abode of loveliness spread through all the three worlds. Greeting Sri Krishna, who had kindled love in their breast, with their eyebrows, whose gracefulness was heightened by their sportful glances, accompanied by bright smiles, and warmly praising him while pressing his hands and feet placed in their lap. They spoke as follows, feeling still a bit enraged. The gopis said, "Some love in return those who love them, while others do just the reverse of it. Still others do not love either. Kindly explain this clearly to us, O Lord." The glorious Lord replied, "They who love one another for mutual benefit, O friends, really love their own self and none other, for their endeavor indeed is solely actuated by self-interest. Neither goodwill nor virtue plays any part there, for such love has a purely selfish motive and not otherwise. They who actually love, even those that do not love them in return, are compassionate and loving too, like one's parents. There is blameless virtue as well as goodwill operating here, O charming girls. Some indeed do not love even those that love them, much less those that do not love them. They are either sages reveling in their own self, having no care for the external world, or those who have realized their ambition and are therefore free from all craving for enjoyment, or dullards who are incapable of appreciating a good turn done to them, or ungrateful people who bear enmity to their own benefactors, though conscious of their services. I, for my part, O friends, do not come under any of these categories, being supremely compassionate and friendly, inasmuch as I do not visibly reciprocate the love and remain out of sight for some time of even those individuals who love me, in order that they could think that they could ever think of me in the same way as a penniless person would on a treasure found by him being lost, remained engrossed in the thought of that wealth alone and would not be sensible to anything else. Indeed, in order to ensure your constant devotion to me, O fair ones, I remained out of your sight for some time, though loving you invisibly and listening to your professions of love with great delight. You who have for my sake ignored all worldly decorum, as well as the injunctions of the Vedas, and deserted your own people. Therefore, O beloved ones, you ought not to find fault with me, your darling. As a matter of fact, I cannot, even through the long life of a heavenly being, 36,000 human years, repay my obligation, the duty of all virtuous men, to you, whose connection with me is absolutely free from blemish, and who have fixed your mind on me, completely cutting asunder the fetters that bound you to your home and which cannot be easily broken. Therefore, let your services to me be repaid by your own goodness." Thus ends the 32nd discourse entitled "The Lord Comforts the Gopis" during the Rasalillah, and the first half of Book 10 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 33, a further description of the Rasalila. Sri Sukha began again. Hearing thus the bewitching words of the Lord, the Gopi women cast off the agony caused by their separation from him, their desire having been fulfilled through the thrilling touch of his divine personality, the embodiment of bliss. Accompanied by those jewels among women, so devoted and affectionate towards him, who stood in a circle with their arms interlocked, Lord Sri Krishna, the protector of cows, inaugurated his celebrated Rasalila on the aforesaid spot on the sandy bank of the Yamuna River. So all of this whole night and this whole section of Krishna's Leela is referred to as the Rasa Leela, but technically speaking, the Rasa Leela is the name of a particular dance. It's defined in the Natya Shastra, sage Bharata's manual on the Vedic arts of dance, that the rasa is the name of a particular dance carried on by a number of women dancing in a circle with their hands interlocked in the company of men who dance with them with arms around the necks of the women. So it's a specific traditional dance that they're doing. Now commenced duly the festive dance of the rasa, adorned with the circle of the aforesaid gopis, standing with their necks encircled by the arms of Sri Krishna, the master of yoga, of inconceivable powers, who appeared to have introduced himself in so many identical forms between every two gopis, and from whom those gopi women imagined to be by their own side. In other words, that each of them thought Krishna was dancing with her alone, but he was simultaneously dancing with all of them. Presently, the firmament was thronged with hundreds of aerial vimanas of heavenly beings, who were accompanied by their consorts and whose mind had been carried away by curiosity in the form of the longing to behold Sri Krishna. Then sounded kettle drums beaten by heavenly beings. Showers of flowers fell, and the chiefs of Gandharvas sang his immaculate glory in chorus with their spouses. There arose a confused din produced by the jingling of bangles and anklets, and the tinkling of tiny bells attached to the girdle of the gopi women, joined with their beloved Lord and that ring of rasa dancers. There in the company of those girls, Lord Sri Krishna, the son of Devaki, shone exceedingly bright, like a large emerald strung in the midst of every two gold beads. A footnote quoting from traditional commentators on the emerald note remarks that Sri Krishna is said in the Bhagavatam repeatedly, as we've already read, to possess the hue of a deep sapphire. Here he has been likened to an emerald, the commentators say, due to his color being blended with the golden hue of the gopis, and thus appearing green rather than his normal deep cerulean. With their measured treads, the motions of their hands, the playful movements of their eyebrows, accompanied with graceful smiles, bending waists, shaking breasts, and the fluttering skirts of their garments, earrings rocking against their cheeks, perspiring faces, and their braids and girdles loosened on account of their swift movement, and celebrating the Lord in song, the aforesaid darlings of Sri Krishna shone brightly like flashes of lightning in a mass of clouds. Engaged in dancing and delighted with the touch of Sri Krishna, the gopis, whose voice was sweetened with love, whose sole delight was loving devotion to Sri Krishna, and whose music filled the whole of this universe, sang at the pitch of their voice. Singing in chorus with Sri Krishna, a certain gopi, Vishakha by name, struck at a high pitch notes altogether different from those of Sri Krishna, and was applauded by the latter, who felt much delighted by her performance in the words, "Well done, bravo." In other words, she was striking a harmony with him. Another girl, Lalita, reproduced the same tune at the top of her voice according to the measure of time technically known by the name of Dhruvapada, which is often shortened to Dhrupad in Gandharva Veda. And the Lord showed abundant regard to her for her excellent performance. Fully tired by the rasa dance, another gopi, probably Sri Radha, clasped with her arm the shoulder of Sri Krishna. Technically, the Bhagavatam here referred to him simply as Lord Vishnu, who stood by her side, her bangles slipping from her wrists and jasmine flowers dropping from her braid due to languor. Smelling the arm, emitting the fragrance of a water lily and smeared with sandal paste and resting on one of her shoulders of Sri Krishna, yet another of those gopis, Shyamala by name, kissed it, so it is said, the hair on her body standing on end due to joy. To a certain gopi, named Shaibya, who united with his cheek her own, lit up with the luster of her earring tossed by the dance, the Lord gave his half-chewed beetle to chew in her own mouth. Fatigued while dancing and singing with her anklets and girdle jingling with the movement of her feet, another gopi, Bhadra, pressed to her bosom the soothing lotus-like palm of Sri Krishna, the immortal Lord, who stood beside her. Having thus secured Sri Krishna, the immortal Lord, the only beloved of the goddess Sri, goddess of beauty and prosperity, as their darling, and celebrating him in song, the gopis sported with him, their necks encircled by his arms. The gopi women, the charm of whose face was heightened by the water lilies adorning their ears, cheeks graced with their locks and drops of sweat glistening, danced with the Lord, keeping time by the jingling of bangles, anklets, and girdle that served as musical instruments, the garlands dropping from their braids, in that assembly of rasa dancers, where humming black bees played the role of songsters. All other music, vocal and instrumental, having stopped by now due to the gopis being exhausted by the constant dancing. Thus, by embracing them, touching them with his hands, casting loving glances at them, making unrestrained amorous gestures, and laughing heartily, Sri Krishna, who is no other than Lord Vishnu, the spouse of the goddess Rama, sported with those lovely women of Raja, even as an infant would play with its own reflections seen through a set of mirrors. Their senses overwhelmed with excessive joy caused by contact with his divine person, and their garlands and ornaments loosened, the women of Raja were not able to adjust as before their unsettled locks, scarf, or even their brassiere or chest cloth, a jewel of the Kurus. Smitten with love to witness the amorous Leela of Sri Krishna, the celestial ladies too, who were watching from the sky, fainted, and the moon god, along with his retinue of the 27 Nakshatra Devis, felt amazed. Sportfully revealing himself in as many forms as there were gopi women, the aforesaid Lord delightfully spent his time with each of them, individually in different forms, though reveling in his own self. With his most blissful hand, O dear Parikshit, the compassionate Lord lovingly wiped the faces of those girls, fatigued as they were by overexertion and dancing. Offering worship to the Supreme Person with the splendor of their cheeks, heightened by the luster of their brilliant gold earrings and curly locks, as well as with their nectar-like smiles and glances, and enraptured by the thrilling touch of his blessed nails, the gopis celebrated in song his purifying exploits. Accompanied by them and followed by black bees, humming like the leaders of Gandharvas and attracted by his garland, squeezed by the embraces of the gopis and tinged with the saffron paint on their bosom, the fatigued Lord, who had transgressed all limits, entered the water of the Yamuna in order to get over his fatigue, even as the leader of a herd of elephants would do in the company of she-elephants after having broken the dams. Profusely sprinkled all over from every side by the young women, who were heartily laughing, in the water, and affectionately regarded by them, O dear Parikshit, and being glorified by the gods, born in their aerial vimanas and showering flowers, the Lord himself sported in their midst, like a leader of elephants, though reveling in his own self. Surrounded by black bees and the bevies of young women, the Lord then rambled in a grove on the bank of the Yamuna, served on all sides by a breeze wafting the fragrance of flowers both on land and in water, even like a tusker shedding temporal fluid and accompanied by she-elephants. The aforesaid Lord of unfailing desire, to whom those bevies of delicate women were so fondly attached, and who voluntarily exhibited in himself the various amorous gestures, thus enjoyed all those nights, since this did not happen just once, but on many nights, illumined with the rays of the full moon and embodying all the charms peculiar to the autumn season and depicted in poetical works. The Raja submitted. It was, in fact, for establishing dharma on a sound footing, as well as for the suppression of that which is a suppression of adharma, that Lord Sri Krishna, the ruler of the universe, descended into the world of matter along with his part manifestation Balarama. How then did he, the promulgator, institutor, and conservator of ethical standards, commit a transgression in the shape of embracing others' wives, O Holy One? With what intention, indeed, did that Lord of the Yadus, who had all his desires fulfilled, perpetrate such a repelling act? Pray resolve this doubt of ours, O sage of sacred vows. Sri Shuka replied, violation of dharma and overboldness is occasionally witnessed on the part of the mighty. It does not, however, bring any sin on those prepossessed of exceptional glory, as in the case of fire that consumes everything, even impure substances such as filth and corpses. He, however, who is not so powerful and is bound by his karma, should never deliberately attempt this, even mentally, for he who does so through folly will meet his ruin, even as anyone other than Rudra would if he were to swallow the poison churned out of the ocean. A precept of the mighty, those possessed of wisdom, dispassion, and so on, is authoritative and therefore worth following, if uttered in right earnest, and not as a test of our wisdom. Their conduct, however, is worth imitating on certain occasions only. Therefore, an intelligent man should follow only such only such conduct as is consistent with their own precept. There is no personal gain to be achieved here through such virtuous conduct by egoless people, nor does any harm come to them through the reverse of such actions, O king. How then could any virtue or sin binding those that are subject to his control attach to the supreme ruler of all creatures, from subhuman creatures, human beings, and even to gods? Whence indeed could there be any bondage for the Lord, who assumed a personality of his own free will, when those who are sated, in the sense that they have no desire left in them, by enjoying the pollen of his lotus feet, as also those who have shaken off all their ties of karma by virtue of their yoga, and even so those who are given to contemplation on their identity with the universal spirit, conduct themselves freely in this world and are never bound by their actions. He alone who indwelt as the inner controller, not only the Gopi women and their husbands, but all embodied souls, who is the witness of all minds, etc., sportfully assumed a personality and manifested himself as Sri Krishna in this world of matter. Having assumed a human semblance in order to shower his grace on and attract towards him created beings, the Lord indulges in leelas like the rasa play, hearing of which man may get exclusively devoted to him. Deluded by his maya, the men of Raja did not regard Sri Krishna with jealousy. Each of them took his womenkind to be present by his side. When the early hours of the morning approached, the Gopis, who were so beloved of the Lord, returned to their homes, though reluctantly, with the approval of Sri Krishna, son of Vasudeva. He who, full of reverence, hears in the proper order of sequence or recounts the story of the aforesaid amorous Leela of Sri Krishna, who is no other than the all-pervading Lord Vishnu, with the women of Vraja, is blessed with supreme devotion to the Lord, and becoming a master of himself before long, speedily overcomes lust, which is a malady of the mind. Thus ends the 33rd discourse, entitled A Description of the Rasalillah, in the first half of Book 10 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 34. The Lord makes short work of Shankarchuda. So this discourse references the slaying of a demon, which was mentioned in the preceding discourse, and seems to be related out of chronological order, possibly by Shuka, but some commentators of the Bhagavatam think that the actual order of the discourses and the copying of the manuscript was switched at some point, and that this one actually belonged a little earlier. In any case, it's certainly set earlier. Sri Shuka began again. Their interest having been aroused in undertaking a pilgrimage for the worship of a god on a certain occasion, the Gopas of Raja rode in their carts drawn by bullocks to a forest known as Ambikavana, which was sacred to goddess Parvati, the mother of the universe. Having bathed in the Sarasvati river there, they worshipped the almighty Lord Shiva, as well as goddess Ambika, his consort, with devotion through various articles of worship, a protector of men. Full of reverence, they all gifted to the Brahmins cows, gold, clothes, sweets, and rice boiled with honey, praying, "May the Lord be propitious to us." Having undertaken sacred vows and subsisting on water alone for the whole day, the highly blessed ones, Nanda, his younger brother Sunanda, and others, spent that night on the bank of the Sarasvati. Sore pinched with hunger, a huge snake arrived in that forest by the will of Providence, and crawling imperceptibly, proceeded to swallow Nanda, who was lying down there. Seized by the python, he cried, "Krishna, O enchanter of all, this huge serpent is devouring me, O darling. Pray deliver me, who have sought you as my refuge." Hearing his cry, as well as his wailing, the Gopas sprang on their feet at once, and bewildered to see him caught in the coils of the serpent, struck the serpent with firebrands. Though being scorched with pieces of burning wood, the reptile did not leave Nanda. Approaching the serpent, Lord Sri Krishna, the protector of the Yadus, touched the animal with his foot. All his evil karma having been wiped out by the touch of the Lord's glorious foot, the animal cast off the body of a serpent instantly, and attained a shining form honored by the Vidyadharas. Sri Krishna, the ruler of the senses, questioned as follows the superhuman being who stood beside him, adorned with a gold necklace and bowing low with a resplendent body. "Who are you that are shining with great splendor, endowed as you are with a weird form? and how were you helplessly cast into this disgusting species? The former serpent replied, I am a Vidyadhara, known by the name of Sudarshana. Endowed with extraordinary splendor and wealth of beauty, I used to fly in an aerial vimana in all directions. Proud of my comeliness, I laughed at some deformed sages born in the line of the sage Angira. I was cast into this form of a python through my own sin by them, derided as they were by me. I now feel that the curse was pronounced by those kind-hearted souls just in order to show their grace to me, and that I had been touched with your foot by you, the Father of the universe, with the result that all my sins have been wiped out. Completely rid of the curse by the touch of your feet, O dispeller of sorrows, I ask leave of you, the celebrated Lord, who dissipate the fears of those who are afraid of rebirth and have sought you as their refuge. I have approached you as my protector, O great yogi, O supreme person, O protector of the righteous. Pray grant me leave, O Lord, O ruler of rulers of all the worlds. I was immediately rid of the Brahmana's curse through your very sight, O immortal Lord. A man uttering your name purifies at once all those who hear him, as well as himself. What wonder then that I, who was actually touched by the feet of such a Lord, yourself, should get purified at once. Thus taking leave of Sri Krishna, the scion of Dasharatha, going round him clockwise and respectfully bowing to him, Sudarshana ascended to heaven, and Nanda too was rescued from his perilous situation. With their minds struck with wonder to witness such peculiar glory of Sri Krishna, and contemplating their religious observances there, the people of Raja returned home from that holy place, O protector of men, talking about it with reverence. On a certain occasion later on, Sri Krishna, the protector of cows, and Balarama of wonderful prowess, sported in the forest at night in the midst of women of Raja. They were being melodiously sung by the womenfolk who had fastened their love on them, were well adorned, had their limbs smeared with sandal paste, and were decked with garlands and dressed in immaculate garments, making much of the advent of night, which was marked by the appearance of the moon and the stars, as well as by the hovering of black bees intoxicated with the fragrance of jasmines. The reason why unusually bees are coming out at night here is because of the night blooming jasmine. And the night was fanned by a breeze charged with the fragrance of water lilies, and simultaneously going through the whole scale of musical notes with a regulated rise and fall of sound, the two brothers sang to the delight of the mind and ears of all created beings. Hearing their song, the Gopi women fell into a trance and did not notice their raiment falling off from their person or their wreath dropped from their braid due to that trance, O protector of men. While the two brothers were thus reveling unconstrainedly and singing as though highly intoxicated, an attendant of Kubera, the bestower of riches, known by the name of Shankachura, arrived there. Nothing daunted, O king, he drove the screaming young women, though protected by them, towards the north before their very eyes. Towards the north holds significance because this being an attendant of Kubera, Kubera is a regent of the north, and towards the north would be the way to draw them into Kubera's own realm, the Loka, the Yakshas. Beholding their own womenfolk crying, "O Krishna, O Balarama," even like cows seized by a robber, the two brothers ran in pursuit, shouting their assurance of safety in the words, "Do not be afraid," with a sal tree in hand, like having picked up a big stick. The two nimble-footed brothers ran with quick steps and speedily overtook that vile Guhyaka. Shuddering to perceive the two brothers close upon his heels like Kala, the time spirit, and death personified, the fool abandoned the womenfolk and ran post-haste with intent to save his own life. Intending to snatch the jewel on his head, Sri Krishna, the protector of cows, chased him whithersoever he ran, while Bala stood guard over the women. Approaching him as though he were not very far off, the Almighty Lord severed the head of that evil-minded fellow, including the jewel on his crest, with a stroke of his fist, O dear Parikshit. Quite a rather grisly and superhuman feat to rip someone's head off with his bare hand. Having thus slain Shankachura and taking his splendid gem, he lovingly presented the gem to his elder brother in the presence of the women who stood looking on with wonder. Thus ends the 34th discourse entitled "The Lord Slays Shankachura," and the first half of Book 10 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. So that happened before the Rasalillah chapter that we read. And in the original manuscripts of the Bhagavatam, it may have actually been before. And either it got moved later or Sri Shuka recited it. Sri Shuka seems to have forgotten it. And then when he was reminded that he didn't tell that one, went back and told it. Discourse 35. The Gopis' song in pairs of verses. Sri Shuka began again. On Sri Krishna having proceeded to the forest for pasturing the cattle, the Gopi women, whose mind accompanied him to the forest, spent their days in anguish, loudly singing his leelas. The Gopis sang, when Sri Krishna, the bestower of liberation, plays on the flute, applied to his lips, the holes of which are gently touched by his delicate fingers, dancing his eyebrows, his left cheek inclined towards the root of his left arm, O Gopi women, the consorts of the Siddhas flying through the air and accompanied by their spouses are struck with wonder to hear that music and blushing to find their mind made a target of the shafts of love, fall into a trance, forgetful of their skirts that get loosened and unsettled in that helpless state. Oh, hear of this strange phenomenon, O delicate women. When this darling of Nanda, on whose bosom smiling with pear necklaces shines goddess Lakshmi in the form of a golden streak like a stationary flash of lightning, sounds his flute, bringing delight to the afflicted people smitten with the pangs of separation from him. Herds of bulls in Vraja, as well as deer and cows in the forest, stand with erect ears as though they were asleep or painted, their mind captivated by the music of the flute heard from a distance, and mouthfuls of grass stay pressed between their teeth without being chewed or swallowed. Whenever the aforesaid Sri Krishna, the bestower of liberation, accompanied by Bala and putting on the garb of a wrestler decorated with a tuft of peacock feathers and tender leaves, and painted with minerals of various colors, O friend, calls the cows by their names, in the company of other gopas, the rivers too find their flow retarded and stand with their arms thrown into motion, as if to fold the Lord in their embrace, and when foiled in their attempt to reach him, yearning for the dust of his lotus feet borne by the breeze, but eventually with their waters stilled as though in despair, possessed as they are of poor merit like ourselves. Whenever Sri Krishna, possessed of everlasting fortune, like Lord Vishnu, the most ancient person, and with his prowess sung in extenso, even as with Lord Vishnu's, by his followers, calls by their respective names the cows grazing on the slopes of the mountain Govardhana with the help of his flute, while roaming about in the forest, the creepers of the forest as well as their trees, laden as they are with flowers and fruits, appear with their boughs bent low under their weight, and with their frames thrilled through ecstasy of love, shed streams of honey, as though manifesting the all-pervading Lord Vishnu indwelling them in the form of rapture. When Sri Krishna, wearing on his forehead a sacred mark so charming to look at, applies the flute to his lips, admiring the high-pitched and agreeable humming of swarms of black bees drunk with the honey of tulsi flowers forming part of his wreath of sylvan flowers, and emitting an ethereal fragrance. The cranes, swans, and other birds dwelling in lakes, dear me, approach Sri Hari, their heart captivated by the dulcet music of the flute, and flock by his side with their mind fully collected and eyes closed and observing complete silence. When accompanied by Bala and gracefully adorned with floral earrings, and standing on the summits of the mountain Govardhana, O beauties of Raja, Sri Krishna fills the universe with the sound of his flute, enrapturing all and filled with delight himself. The cloud rumbles in gentle tones as if keeping time with his tune, and afraid at heart, as it were, of showing disrespect to the Great One, and covers his friend with a shower of flowers in the form of spray, spreading over him an umbrella with his shadow. When placing the flute between his lips, ruddy as a ripe bimba fruit, O Yashoda, virtuous lady, your son, an expert in the various games played by Gopas, evolves varied original tunes in the domain of flute playing. The chief of the Devas, headed by Indra, Lord Shiva, the god of destruction, and Brahma, the highest functionary of the universe, listen to that music again and again with their neck and mind inclined towards the quarter from which the sound comes, and unable to penetrate into its subtleties, learned as they are, fall into confusion. When playing on his flute, Sri Krishna walks with the gait of an elephant, soothing the pain of the soil of Raja caused by the hoofs of the cattle, by the soles of his own tender feet resembling the petals of a lotus and bearing the weird marks of a flag, thunderbolt, lotus, and goad. We in whom our fire of love is kindled by his amorous glances, and who are reduced to the state of trees by the sight of his graceful movements. In other words, motionless and without thought. Are no longer conscious of our braid or even of our dress due to infatuation. Whenever, wearing a string of beads of various colors and counting the herds of cows with the help of those beads, and resting his arm on the shoulder of a loving follower, Sri Krishna, adorned with a wreath of tulsi flowers, the fragrance of which is so dear to him, sings somewhere the she-deer, the companions of black antelopes, whose mind is carried away by the music of his sounding flute, continue to be with Sri Krishna, the ocean of virtues, once they meet him, having abandoned, like us, the Gopi women, all hopes of returning to their home. When, having gaily decorated himself with wreaths of jasmine flowers, and surrounded by Gopa boys and his cattle wealth, your darling Sri Krishna, Nanda's son, O sinless Yashoda, sports on the bank of the Yamuna, giving delight to his loving companions. A gentle breeze fans him agreeably, welcoming him by its cool and fragrant touch like that of sandal paste. And hosts of divine beings, Gandharvas and others, who play the role of panegyrists, wait upon him with their instrumental and vocal music and offerings of various kinds, and thereby delay his return to Vraja. With intent to grant the desire of his near and dear ones, here comes Sri Krishna, a veritable moon born of Devaki's womb, who is so fond of the people of Raja as well as of the cows, for whose sake he held up the mountain for full 7 days, collecting all the cattle wealth at the close of the day, playing on his flute and bringing delight to the eyes of all, even by the splendor of his fatigued person, his feet being adored on the way by the oldest of the old, Brahma and others, his glory being sung by his followers and his garland covered all over with the dust raised by the hoofs of the cattle. With his eyes somewhat rolling through inebriety, and his face turned pale as a ripening plum, lighting up as he does his soft cheeks with the splendor of his gold earrings, Sri Krishna, the Lord of the Yadus, who is adorned with a wreath of sylvan flowers, wears a cheerful countenance and bestows honor on his near and dear ones, is coming over there even as the moon at the close of day, sporting as the leader of a herd of elephants and relieving the day-long and endless agony of separation of the women of Raja, who are to him as docile and deserving of protection as cows. Sri Shuka continued, in this way, O Parikshit, the women of Raja, whose intellect and mind were absorbed in him and who were therefore full of great rejoicing, delightfully spent their time, even during the day when he was away, celebrating in song the Leelas of Sri Krishna. Thus ends the 35th discourse, entitled The Gopis' Songs in Pairs of Verses, in the first half of Book 10 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. So the verse structure of all of those songs is pretty much lost in translation. But in Sanskrit, all of those songs were in metrical poetic couplets. Discourse 36. Kansa sends Akrura to Vraja to bring Sri Krishna and Balarama to Mathura. Sri Shuka began again. Some time after this, there came to Vraja Arishta, a demon disguised as a bull with a huge body and a large hump, shaking the earth torn by his hoofs. He was bellowing very harshly and breaking the earth with his hoofs. Uplifting his tail, he was throwing up the mounds of earth with the ends of his horns, and was discharging dung and urine in small quantities at intervals, and staring with unwinking eyes. At his violent and thunder-like roar, O dear Parikshit, cows and women were prematurely delivered of their offspring at an initial or advanced stage of gestation, indeed through fear, and clouds settled on his hump, mistaking it for a hillock. Perceiving that animal with sharp horns, the cowherds and cowherdesses felt dismayed, and the cattle fled in terror, leaving Vraja far behind, O king. Crying, Krishna, O enchanter of all, they all sought Govinda as their refuge. Observing this and reassuring the people of Vraja driven off by fright in the words, do not be afraid, the Lord too challenged the diabolical bull, saying, What will you gain, O fool, through the cattle and the cowherds being terrified thus, O vilest creature? Here am I to crush the pride, born of might, of the wicked and evil-minded like you. Slapping his arms by way of challenge to a duel, and provoking Arishta by means of the sound produced thereby, the immortal Sri Hari stood, stretching his serpent-like arm on the shoulder of a boy companion. Thus angered, the aforesaid Arishta rushed toward Sri Krishna in a fury, furrowing the earth with his hoofs, the clouds dispersing at the touch of his erect tail. With the ends of his horns thrust forward and his bloodshot eyes remaining winkless, the animal darted forthwith towards Sri Krishna, even like the thunderbolt hurled by Indra, threatening him with his side glances. Seizing him by the horns, the Lord actually pushed him back, like an elephant driving a rival elephant, to a distance of 18 steps. Knocked down by the Lord, the bull quickly rose again, and filled with fury, rushed forward, sweating all over and breathing hard. Seizing tightly the demon by the horns, even as he came rushing, and throwing him to the ground, the Lord set his foot on him, and pressing him at one end with his feet, wrung him like a drenched cloth, and then, pulling off his horn, struck him with it till he fell prostrate. Vomiting blood, discharging urine and dung profusely, and throwing up his feet with his eyes rolling, the demon experienced great agony and eventually met his end at the hands of death in the disguise of Sri Krishna. The gods in heaven applauded Sri Hari, covering him with flowers. Having thus disposed of the demon in the form of the bull, and being glorified by his own kinsmen, the cowherds, Sri Krishna, the feast of the Gopis' eyes, accompanied by Bala, who had joined him on hearing of his encounter with the bull, entered Vraja once more. The demon Arishta having been slain by Sri Krishna of miraculous deeds, the holy Narada, who was gifted with divine vision, presently called on and told Kansa of the female child, which was supposed to be the eighth progeny of Devaki and had escaped death at his hands, being, as a matter of fact, a daughter of Yashoda, as well as of Sri Krishna being the eighth offspring of Devaki, and of Balarama being a son of Rohini, as also of the two brothers, by whom Kansa's men had been actually made short work of, having been placed by the terrified Vasudeva, their real father, in the charge of his friend Nanda. Kansa, the chief of the Bhojas, whose mind was agitated through anger to hear this revelation, snatched a sharp-edged sword with the intention of killing Vasudeva. Stopped by Narada, and coming to know from him of the two sons of Vasudeva, to have been ordained by Providence to be his death, he instead bound Vasudeva along with his wife Devaki with iron fetters, yet again. Put them back in prison. The celestial sage, having now returned to his abode in the highest heaven, Kansa conferred with Keshi, another demon, and dispatched him to Vraja with the order, "Let Balarama and Keshava be disposed of by you." Surely this is not actually how he put it, because Keshava refers to the slaying of this demon Keshi, but rather it's a poetic way for Sri Shuka to refer to it in the context of that very story. Summoning in his presence Mushtika, Chanura, Shala, Toshalaka, and others, who were all renowned experts in unarmed combat, as well as his ministers and keepers of elephants, Kansa, the king of the Bhojas, then said, "Oh, let this command of mine be listened to and obeyed forthwith. O heroic Chanura and Mushtika, I hear the two sons of Anakadundhubi, Balarama and Krishna, are dwelling in Nanda's Vraja. At their hands, I am told, has my death been decreed. Let the two boys, when arrived here, be killed by you in a game of wrestling. Let galleries of diverse designs be erected in the form of an amphitheater round the arena for the wrestlers. And let all the people of the city, as well as of the country, the kingdom of Mathura, witness this voluntary combat. O keeper of my elephants, O blessed one, let the mighty elephant, Kuvalayapida, be brought to and stationed at the main entrance of the amphitheater, and kill through this elephant my two juvenile enemies. Let a bow sacrifice, a Dhanusha Yajna, in which Lord Shiva is worshipped in the form of a bow, and which is recommended in the works on Shiva worship, the Shaiva Agamas, as conducive to victory over enemies, be commenced with due ceremony on the coming 14th lunar day. Let the priests immolate animals fit to be sacrificed to Lord Shiva, the ruler of the spirits, and popularly worshipped, even to this day at Mathura, under the name of Sri Bhuteshvara, the bestower of all boons. Having thus commanded his servants, Kansa, who was well versed in various methods of achieving his personal ends, summoned Akrura, the foremost of the Yadus and a kinsman of Vasudeva, and clasping his hand with his own, addressed him as follows: O chief of the charitably disposed, let an act of friendship be done to me. None else is more honored and more friendly to me than you in the race of the Bhojas and the Vrishnis. I therefore depend on you, O gentle one, as the means of accomplishing a great purpose, even as the mighty Indra attained his end, in the form of sovereignty of the three worlds that had been usurped by Bali, the Asura king, depending as he did on Lord Vishnu, descended in the form of Vamana, the divine dwarf, his younger brother. Proceed at once to Nanda's Vraja. There reside the two sons of Anakadundabi. Anakadundabi is another name of Vasudeva. Bring them both here in this chariot. Let there be no delay. My death, I understand, has been preordained at the hands of the younger one by the Devas, who have their refuge in Vishnu. Fetch them along with the Gopas headed by Nanda and equipped with tributes of various kinds. I shall have them dispatched when brought down here by my elephant, who is as good as death. If they escape it, I shall get them killed by wrestlers like thunderbolts. On the two brothers having been killed, I shall do away with their afflicted kinsmen, the Vrishnis, the Bhojas, and the Dasharahas, headed by Vasudeva, as well as my aged father Ugrasena, who was anxious to regain his sovereignty, his brother Devaka, and whoever else are my enemies. And then this earth, O my friend, will be rid of thorns. Jarasandha, my father-in-law, is my father, is as good as my father. While Dvivida, the Vanara chief, is my beloved friend. The Vanaras are the monkey-like race. Hanuman is the most famous example of them, but there is a corrupt one named Dvivida who is an ally of Kamsa. Shambhara, Naraka, and Bana have entered into alliance with me. These are all famous demon lords. Destroying with their help all kings who are siding with the Devas, I shall rule over the entire globe myself. Knowing this, but not disclosing my intention to the people of Raja, fetch the two youngsters, Balarama and Krishna, here at once, so as to enable them to witness the bow sacrifice, as well as to behold the splendor of Mathura, the capital of the Yadus. In other words, this is the excuse that should be given to bring them here. Akrura replied, well thought out is your remedy against the evil that stares you in the face. One should, however, keep one's mind balanced in success and failure, for it is providence that procures the fruit of our endeavors. Man entertains high aspirations, even though they are thwarted by providence, and thus meets with joy and grief. Nevertheless, I shall do your bidding. Sri Shuka continued, having thus instructed Akrura and sent away his counselors, Kamsa retired into the gymnasium, and Akrura too returned to his house to prepare for his trip. Thus ends the 36th discourse, entitled Kamsa Dispatches Akrura, in the first half of Book 10 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Yeah, I think we've got time for one more. It's not very long, and it makes a good ending point. Discourse 37, the demon Vyoma slain. Sri Shuka began again. Dispatched by Kansa and anxious to oblige him, the aforesaid Keshi of evil intent, for his part, went to Nanda's Vraja in the form of a colossal horse, quick as thought, with big eyes, a fearful cave-like mouth, and a huge neck, and resembling a large dark cloud, pounding and shaking the earth with its hoofs, crowding the firmament with clouds and aerial cars dispersed by its manes, and terrifying all with its neighs. Placing himself in the forefront, the Lord challenged the diabolical horse that was frightening the inhabitants of his Vraja with its neighs, as aforesaid, throwing the clouds into commotion by the hair of its tail and seeking after him for a duel. And the animal roared loudly like a lion when thus challenged. Beholding him, the animal, which was not only difficult to approach and possessed of terrible speed, but formidable too, turned round and ran towards him full of rage, and drinking the heavens, as it were, with its wide open mouth, struck the lotus-eyed Lord with its hind legs. Dodging the stroke and seizing the horse by its hind legs, Sri Krishna whirled it in a rage with his arms, and flinging it disdainfully to a distance of 100 bows, even as Garuda, son of the sage Kashyapa, would throw a serpent, stood as before as if nothing had happened. Having recovered its senses and rising up again, the said Keshi rushed towards Sri Hari with great speed, opening its mouth in fury. Krishna, smilingly thrust his left arm into its mouth, as playfully as a snake charmer would put a serpent into a hole. Touching the Lord's arm, the teeth of Keshi dropped down as they would on touching a heated iron rod. Finding its way into its body, the arm of Sri Krishna swelled to an enormous degree, even as the fluid collecting in the body of a man suffering from the disease of dropsy would if neglected. With its breath choked by the immensely swelling arm of Sri Krishna and its eyes rolling and profusely sweating all over, the animal dropped dead on the ground, throwing up its legs and passing excrement. Drawing out his arm from its dead body, which resembled a ripe cucumber that had burst open at several places, the mighty armed lord, who had killed the enemy without any effort, and stood unelated, as if this was no big triumph for him, was glorified by the highly amazed denizens of heaven, who showered flowers. Approaching Sri Krishna, who was unwearied in action, the celestial sage Narada, the foremost of the Lord's votaries, or protector of men, spoke to him in secret as follows. O Krishna, of incomprehensible character, O enchanter of all, O master of yoga, possessed of inconceivable powers, O ruler of the universe, O Vasudeva, present in all beings, the abode of all, the foremost of the Yadus, O almighty Lord, you are the one spirit, indwelling all created beings and remaining concealed like the fire hidden in logs of wood, enshrined inside the intellect, the witness, the supreme person, the almighty Lord. Depending on your own self, you evolved the three gunas at the dawn of creation by your Maya, which is no other than your own self. And with their help, you create, protect, and absorb into your own self this visible universe, unfailing of purpose and almighty as you are. As such, you have descended into the world of matter for the annihilation of demons, goblins, and ogres, born as the conservators of the earth, born as kshatriyas, and for the protection of the virtuous, who are the living standards of morality. Luckily enough, by you has been sportfully slain this demon in the form of a horse, frightened by whose neighs the devas, whose eyelids never fall, evacuated heaven. The day after tomorrow, I shall see Chanura and Mushtika and other wrestlers, as well as the elephant Kuvalayapida and Kansa himself, slain by you, O almighty Lord. After that, I shall witness the death of the demon Panchajana, the Ionian hero Kalayavana, and the demon Mura, as well as of Naraka, and the carrying off of the Parijata tree and the discomfiture of Indra. Here he's just revealing his knowledge of the future. I shall also behold the espousal of the daughters of heroes, who will be distinguished by the fact that the show of valor will be the price paid by you, and so on, and shall witness the deliverance of King Nriga at Dwaraka from sin. O Lord of the universe, I shall also witness the acceptance by you of the brilliant gem Syamantaka along with Jambavati, as well as the restoration to a Brahmana of his deceased son to be brought by you from your own divine abode, the realm of Mahakala. I shall witness the destruction of King Paundraka, and later on the setting on fire of the city of Kashi, and the death of Dantavaktra and Shishupala in the course of a great yajna. I shall also witness those feats of valor that you will perform while residing in Dwaraka, and which will be celebrated in song by the poets on earth. I shall then behold the extermination of a number of Akshohinis by yourself as Arjuna's charioteer, and assuming the role of Kala, actually bent on the dissolution of this universe. We approach the Almighty Lord in you, who is pure consciousness personified, who has fully achieved all his ends by virtue of his being established in his own blissful existence, whose desire never fails to yield its fruit, and by whose effulgence in the form of consciousness, the stream of the three gunas in the shape of the world process, having its origin in Maya, is ever shut out from him. In other words, the gunas and worldliness do not enter into him, but he into them. I bow to you, the self-dependent Almighty Lord, who has evolved this varied creation out of all these differentiated categories, the Mahatattva, etc., brought forth by his own Maya, and who has now, for the sake of Leela, assumed a human semblance as the foremost of the Yadus, the Vrishnis, and the Sattvatas. Sri Shuka continued, having thus bowed low to Sri Krishna, the Lord of the Yadus, and gladly permitted by him, the sage Narada, the foremost of the Lord's devotees, who was filled with ecstatic delight at his sight, departed for his abode in Satyaloka. Having made short work of the demon Keshi in combat, Lord Sri Krishna, the protector of cows, continued to tend the cattle as usual in the company of the Gopa boys, who were deeply attached to him, bringing delight to the entire Vraja. Once, while pasturing the cattle on the mountain heights, the Gopa boys played various games of cleverly smuggling others' goods under the guise of thieves and guards. Of them, some played the part of the thieves and others acted as the watchmen, a protector of men, while still others of the Gopas played the role of rams. In this way, they sported fearlessly. Maya's son, Vyoma, a demon who was adept in great conjuring tricks and who made his appearance there in the guise of a Gopa boy, often playing the part of a thief, carried away many Gopa boys that were playing the role of rams. Laying down each Gopa boy, he carried away into a mountain cave. The mighty demon closed the cave's entrance with a large slab of stone. In this way, only 4 or 5 of the Gopas remained outside the cave. Perceiving that work of the demon, Sri Krishna, who affords protection to the righteous, forcibly seized that demon, even as he was carrying away the cowherd boys, just as a lion would seize a wolf. Resuming his natural demoniac form, resembling a huge mountain, the powerful demon, who was feeling pained by the grip of Krishna, sought to extricate himself but could not. Catching hold of the demon by the arms and dashing him on the ground, Sri Krishna, the immortal Lord, made short work of him by gagging him and squeezing his windpipe, while the gods in heaven stood looking on. Having broken asunder the rock that blocked the mouth of the cave and rescuing the Gopa boys from their uncomfortable situation, and being glorified by the gods as well as the Gopas, the Lord withdrew to his realm of Vraja. Thus ends the 37th discourse entitled The Demon Vyoma Slain, in the first half of Book 10 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. And that, I think, is probably a good stopping point for today. It's just after 10, and with the next discourse, we really start with Akrura's arrival, and that leads directly into the whole Krishna going to Mathura and slaying Kansa cycle of the story.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming, Nisha-ji.
Right. Okay, let me start. So, yes, right. Thank you so much. It's always great. I'm sure Andy probably has some questions and I would be happy to listen. But what was a reminder was the Rasalillah, that Ras, the dance.
Yeah.
And growing up back home, we used to do that. And there used to be actually in the schools, there used to be a competition so the groups from the schools, like how we have the leagues here, right? Yeah. For the sports league, we will have the leagues for the Ras, where the schools will compete against the other, and that's what was a great reminder.
Yeah.
Well, Andy doesn't have any questions today. I hope to hear it.
Oh, I'd be curious about some of your insights on that for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
What I kind of missed. What happened with Sankachuda? Was that his name?
Shankarchuda, yeah, that was one of the demons.
What did he do? I missed that. How did he freak Krishna out so much?
Shankarchuda, he was
really quick.
Yeah, I believe he was the one who attempted to abduct a bunch of gopis.
Oh, okay. I missed that little. There was a quick note in there. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Balarama and Krishna chased him down, and Krishna tore off his head barehanded. Yeah.
Okay, attempted abductions though. Gotcha. Yeah.
I'm just double checking that there were several various demons mentioned.
Like right at the end of.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he tried to abduct a bunch of gopis.
Okay, abduction. Gotcha.
Yep.
Charges. I just had a couple of quick questions of that I've always kind of wondered. Well, one was I've always wondered, and one I just noticed that in today's reading. How many nights was the Rasalillah?
The only thing that it says in the Bhagavatam itself, it describes one night in detail, but it mentioned at one point that they did this over many nights. In the autumm.
Any other
it mentions it always being under the full moon. So it seems to have been like maybe something they did every full moon night in the autumn season. But now several of the commentators on the Bhagavatam have gone into more detail on this and said things that like to the gopis, the night of the Rasalillah was the full length of a night of Brahma, that as if Krishna drew them out of the time cycle. And the Rasalillah, some of the commentators, some of the Vaishnava sages say that the Rasalillah for them went on like trillions of years.
Like yugas. Oh my God.
But the Bhagavatam itself doesn't say that. But that's in some of the commentators.
So the way I relate that, like when we are saying that, it went in for certain yugas. So it was more like the feeling of all the gopis to leave that moment as years, like years of their life, because they were either you call it like transcended or just like being with it.
Yeah.
And if I just recall the way we were told the stories as a children, was because all those gopis, like, their devotion and their love, that everyone, all of them, like 200 or whatever, they all thought that Krishna is doing the ras or the playing, but with each individuals.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So it was more like that whole devotion. They're all feeling that Krishna is personally, basically just with them. And they said, okay, then Krishna appeared as a 200 playing the ras with every single one.
Yeah.
And then that whole oneness and the devotion that they felt was just like living billions of lives.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah,
yes.
like many years.
Oh, cool.
Yes, being in that enchanted moment, they forgot about the time. So it was right.
Yeah.
Nice.
Something like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's nice. It's all bringing. For me, we learned, or we were just told as like like the stories at night, or with mom, sitting, like how we read the stories to our children, and that's how all these things were brought in. Sometimes we'll have it in a school, like as I said, like all these were actually weaved into the school work and everything, like in the acts.
Right.
And hearing about it, after 50 years and discussing about it and making a sense from a different perspective, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow. One other question. I've heard different perspectives on this. How many gopis were there?
I don't believe the Bhagavata Purana ever gives a number.
Right.
Some of the other Puranas do.
Right.
The Brahma Vaivarata Purana refers to there being many thousands of them.
Right.
And like you were, like Dr. Nishan, you were saying like 200 or so. That's typically kind of how it's portrayed.
Wow.
And part of, so there's a lot of aspects you could bring to the answer of how many gopis there were. First of all, in the actual folk traditions of the Vraja region, because Vraja is still there. Vraja is still there in India. Vrindavana is still there. These are still, inhabited cities. All these sites of these leelas are holy sites with temples and shrines and holy stones and pilgrimages going on and active worship every day. And they have all these traditions of these villages that were within the forest and which gopis were from which village. And they're like these villagers, around Govardhana Hill, which is still there and everything, are all very proud of like these particular gopis were from this village, and would talk about how a bunch of gopis would come from miles around and like journey days to visit the particular village that Krishna lived in for some of these big festivals in the autumn. But then you get stuff like in the Brahma Vaivarta Mahapurana that talk about huge numbers of thousands. And a typical explanation for this is actually given in the in multiple places, but the main place where it's enumerated is in the Matsya Purana. In the Matsya Purana, it breaks down that different Puranas refer to different revolutions of the Kalpa cycle. It's called Kalpa Bheda, the general theory of explaining differences between different Puranas like this. That the Puranas themselves say that all of these Leelas happen cyclically in every revolution of the Kalpa, but not always identically. They can be different in different times. And so if one Purana refers to, for example, the Bhagavatam describes the Gopas in the forest as not even building houses initially. They're just like, they show up in a ring of carts and they're like nomads driving their cows, and they make like a crescent of their carts and sleep hedging in the cows. And they only even make little temporary structures, whereas something like the Brahma Vaivarta Purana describes them as having palaces and like huge amounts of riches, and there being like cities of thousands of them here. And the Puranas, this isn't necessarily a contradiction. The Puranas describe that the Leelas are played out differently in each revolution of the cycle. So it very well may have been one way in a certain cycle and a very different way with the same underlying stuff. If Krishna comes and does most of the same Leelas and does the Rasalillah with the Gopis and so on, the avatar comes in the cycle. But it doesn't necessarily happen exactly the same way in terms of size of the local population, how many souls had the good karma that time around to be part of the Leela and to live there. It happens differently in different Puranas like that. And so that's part of why you'll get differences. It even says the Matsya Purana breaks down 1-to-1 for every Purana which kalpa it's talking about. In a very systematic way. So
wow, maybe we should read that next. Sounds like fascinating.
Happy to, yeah. The Purana that actually refers to our present cycle, according to the Matsya Purana, is neither the Matsya Purana nor the Bhagavata Purana. It's actually the Vishnu Purana. If you go to any Hindu temple or any Hindu priest at the start of a yajna, they all agree that the current kalpa we're in is the Shveta Varaha kalpa, the kalpa of the white boar. And the Bhagavata Purana actually refers, according to the Matsya Purana, the Bhagavata Purana refers to the Saraswati kalpa. And the Purana that relates to the present cycle, the Shveta Varaha kalpa, is the Vishnu Purana. So that, in theory, could be taken to be the most precisely relevant version to the cycle we're currently in.
Wow.
If you go by the Matsya Purana breakdown of Kalpa Bheda. But anyway, that gets into the traditional explanation for the differences in accounts like that from different versions.
What you may have said, but what does it say the Shrimad Bhagavatam is referring to? What kalpa?
Saraswati Kalpa.
Oh, which took place how many billions of years ago?
Oh, vastly. There isn't always actually a list given of the precise order of the kalpas.
Oh, wow.
They mostly break down like the manvantaras within the kalpa.
How many kalpas do they say they've been?
How many kalpas do they say there have been? So there's 100 in a life of Brahma. I think we're on like 52 or something like that, close to the middle.
Wow.
Yeah, I would have to double check that. We've had that in the Bhagavatam, like long ago in one chapter. It said how many kalpas through the current life of Brahma we are. I think it's like approximately 52 out of 100. It's right about in the midpoint.
Amazing.
Just past the middle. Yeah.
So there'd be that many Rasalillas.
Presumably.
Yeah, that's a good connection.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right.
Far out.
This was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Devla.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Dr. N.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Guys.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Devla, and anybody who is out there.
Mm-hmm.
I think the next Ekadashi is right before our next meeting.
Oh yeah, yeah, it may be.
I'm gonna look it up real quick. In America here, it's actually everywhere except starting in the mount. Okay, this is the ISKCON calculation. Okay, so right. I know there's different, but the ISKCON calc says next Saturday for Iowa, right, and it actually splits at Mountain Time Zone to Friday. Mountain Time Zone like Denver, California, and Hawaii are next Friday.
Yeah,
and then everybody else, India, Europe, everywhere is next Saturday, the 12th of February, getting us all purified for Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
That's sweet. So what is it in our Eastern zone? What would it be?
Saturday, the 12th,
Saturday.
February 12th.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
This is ISKCON, so you might want to check out, was it Dharma Singha or something like that? No, something.
Yeah.
I forget the other. Anyways, but yeah,
Right.
ISKCON. That's
Right.
Saturday.
Okay, thank you so much for always bringing out this Ekadashi. You always bring that out. Thank
Yeah.
you.
It goes real
Yeah.
well with this with these readings.
It does. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
the fasting and the cleansing and yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Happy Vasant Panchami too. That was yesterday.
Oh, what's that?
Saraswati's Puja Day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Right.
Her main holy day of the year.
Beautiful. Incredible.
Yep. All right. Thank you guys.
Both.
Okay.
Hare Krishna.
Hare
Hare
Krishna.
Krishna.